Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Productivity Show. And today with me, I have not one, but two special co hosts with me. I have Brooks Duncan, the CEO of Asian Efficiency, and then also Marmel, the dog rescuer from from the team. How are you two doing today?
I'm doing great. Really, really happy to have Marmel here. It's always a treat when she comes on the show, and to have all three of us here at the same time is very exciting.
Yep, same here. Pretty excited. So it's good to be back on the podcast together with Brooks and Tian. So I'm ready to get started.
So Marmel's official title is actually Scrum Master, not dog rescuer, but she's a big animal lover. So we had to introduce her as an animal lover. But if you're not familiar with what a Scrum Master is, it's kind of an upgraded version of a project manager. That's how I like to think of it. That kind of like makes people kind of understand what you really do, Marmel. But there's more to that, and we have tons of episodes already talking about Scrum and stuff like that. So definitely check out those episodes if you haven't already. But today we're going to be talking about, if we were going to start over, what would we do? And before we dive into that, we always like to kick things off with our top three favorite resources as of lately. And Brooks, I hear you have a few items for us here today. What do you got in store for us?
Yeah, really happy to share our top three resources. Sometimes I like to share resources from internally the Asian efficiency team, either myself or other team members. But sometimes I like to share resources from our dojo members, which is our productivity community. So that's what I'm going to do this time. So these are three things that our dojo members have been loving these days. Number one is called the Ironman Expand Your Hand Bands. And we have a link to it in the show notes. But basically, these are a series of mini elastic bands that you can use to strengthen your hands, rehab if you have like stress from carpal tunnel or tennis elbow. Basically, it'll help you strengthen and reduce and prevent pain in your hands. So the Ironman Expand Your Hand Bands, that's number one. Number two is the Wicked Cushions upgraded replacement ear pads for the Bose, and the ones I'll list are the QC35, since those are the headphones that we all use. However, they have different versions for the different model of Bose headphones. There are official replacement ear pads that you can get from Bose. I believe Tan and Marmel, both of you have purchased those at certain times. However, Matt from the dojo recommends these Wicked Cushions ones. So I'm not sure if they're cheaper or if it's just that they're on Amazon, but these are ones that he likes a lot. So if your ear pads on your Bose headphones are getting either broken or lost or just need to be replaced, those are an alternative. And number three is a recommendation from dojo members Tom and Matt, and it's a macOS app called Hook. So this is a very nerdy app, and what it allows you to do is create links to anything in most Mac apps. And so you can directly jump to different information in different Mac apps. So you could say have a link from your task manager to something specific in a certain app. And it basically allows you to automate and create links between different things on your Mac. Unfortunately, I don't know a Windows replacement for that, but Hook is a growing in popularity app for the Mac. So those are the top three resources.
Awesome. Thank you, Brooks. And we'll have links to everything that we just talked about in the show notes. So if you go to theproductivityshow.com/343, you'll find them there as well. And if you're listening to us in an app, just swipe and you'll see the links there as well. So let's start diving in. And I want to announce that next week's episode is about the accountability trifecta. And we're having a guest on there with us, Coach Debbie Rosemont, where we're going to be talking about the power of accountability and how you can incorporate it into your life. So if that's something you need, definitely go check out next week's episode as well. So Brooks, Marmel, and then myself are going to be sharing right now. If we were going to start over, here's what we would do. And I'm going to go first, and then Marmel is going to go second, and then Brooks will go last. So what was the inspiration for this episode? Well, there's a lot of things you could be doing when it comes to productivity, being more efficient, being more effective. And we thought, what would be a good episode for people who have been listening to us for a while, or maybe are brand new to this, or people who are kind of like into it already, but want to simplify things. Well, if we had to start all over again, I think that's a great source of content and value for a lot of people, because it has to you kind of have to force yourself to distill the simplicity and the things that are really most important. And when I think about if I had to start all over again, here's what I would do. The number one thing that came up for me was learning about self-management and just understanding the idea of like, how do I work best? Because one of the things I've kind of been harping on a podcast and in some of our courses as well is just the idea of self-awareness is the ultimate productivity hack. And the more you understand what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, how you tend to show up best, this is how you can really maximize how you get stuff done and are able to accomplish your goal. Because one thing might work for me, but might not work for you. And there's a lot of productivity advice out there. There's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of things that you can do. And there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. But ultimately, you have to find something that works for you. And so the best way to kind of do that is to really learn about yourself. And a couple of things you could be doing is something like taking personality tests, right? We're big fans of the Colby test, which you can take for about $100. And it kind of gives you a score, a 4-digit score. And that will kind of show you cognitively how you operate and how you just function best, right? You can take the Myers-Briggs. You can take all these other different personality tests like DISC, which is DISC. And if you take all these different tests, like if I had to start all over again, I would actually take those 3 different tests and kind of understand how I naturally operate. Because to give you a really simple example, some people work really well when there's a really strict deadline and it's like 48 hours away and they have to like get a lot of stuff done. That actually doesn't work for me because I'm someone who doesn't like chaos or doesn't like a lot of stress or have a huge sense of urgency. I like to be able to be a kind of like a week in advance, be completely done, or at least if I'm working on it a week in advance, know that I'll be getting it done like 2 or 3 days in advance, and then have some buffer room for like optimization, double checking stuff, right? So I was the type of kid in school where if something needed to be done by Thursday, I would have it done by Tuesday. And then if something came up, I would then still have Wednesday night to kind of like put the finishing touches on something like that. And so you can apply this idea in many different ways, right? So for example, other things you can consider is, how much sleep do you need? Do you need 8 hours? Do you only need 6 hours? Like everyone's going to be different, right? Are you a morning person or are you a night owl? Or are you someone who gets a burst of energy a different part of the day? What are some of the things you enjoy doing? Is it like analytical stuff, or are you more of a creative person? Like how can you kind of like learn about yourself in that way? And once you do, it's so much easier to get into flow, right? So those are the things that I would like really recommend to someone who's listening right now and saying, hey, if I were to start all over again, this is what I would recommend.
Okay, well, sorry about that. So I think your example of knowing yourself and knowing what works for you is so important, because there is so much productivity advice out there. And we are on episode number 343 of this podcast. We've done hundreds or maybe even thousands of blog posts over the years. And I think what happens a lot of times is we will read some piece of advice and we go down one of 2 paths. Number one, we either try to implement something that just is not going to work for us. So that is problem number one. It's almost like doomed to fail right from the beginning. Or problem number 2 is we reject something out of hand because we think it doesn't fit in with what our we reject one piece, a whole thing, because one piece of it doesn't work for us, and we ignore the stuff that actually would fit in well with the way we work, the values we have, and that sort of thing. So if you know what it is that works best for you, and this is a lot of times you're only going to find this out through a little bit of experimentation, it just makes it so much easier to evaluate the stuff that you're reading and hearing as you go through. I do want to address one question that came up from Giacomo in our live stream. So we live stream these recordings with TPS Plus members, which is our premium version of the podcast at theproductivityshow.com/plus. So our TPS Plus members and our Dojo members. And Giacomo asks, isn't, the idea behind this episode is if we were starting over, here's what we would do. And Giacomo asks, isn't part of the journey to become of where you are today is to make errors. Like, don't you learn a lot from trying something, making mistakes, trying something else? And yeah, I would definitely say that is an important part of the journey. But if you can learn from somebody else's mistakes, if you can see what someone else does and see how, get an idea for something you can try, it's almost like a cheat code. It's almost like saving yourself a lot of time and heartache if you can learn from something else, something that someone else does. How about you, Marmel? Did you go through this journey yourself of figuring out what works best for you? Like what sort of things have you applied?
When I started with Asian efficiency, the first thing that Tan asked me to do was take the Kobe assessment, right? It was the first time that I heard about it, and there were a lot of the things about that test I didn't know about. I didn't know about myself, or maybe I knew but really didn't think about it. I think it's important when you're self-aware. I think you cut off probably half of the learning process, because now you don't have to keep on experimenting, because you already know, what you're capable of and where you need to make adjustments in the habits that you have to make or the systems that you have to create. So I think, being self-aware is very important. And if I have to do a reset, like when I started working, it's probably one of the first things that I'm going to do as well.
Yeah, I think is what you were saying earlier, Brooks. Learning from other people's mistakes in response to Giacomo. Um, I'm one of the things I'm really good at is butchering quotes. So this is going to be one of those. Was just the idea of like a smart person learns from his or her own mistakes, but a wise person learns from other people's mistakes. And this is like one of those situations where it's smart to learn from your own mistakes, and that's part of the journey, but it's even smarter to learn from other people's mistakes, and even wiser to do so. And in this case, like if there's anything I could pass on based on my last 12, 13 years of experience of just teaching people how to be more productive going on my own journey, is just the idea of self-awareness. Like the more you can kind of start out the gate with that, the much easier things just become rolling forward. So that's my first take on this. So before we move on to Marmel as the second point here, I want to remind everyone that we also have an upgraded version of the podcast called TPS Plus. So if you want to get our episodes ad-free, get extra bonus content, get episodes a week early, and get other bonus audio materials from us, such as the T Framework course and the T-shirt, for being a TPS Plus listener, be sure to go to theproductivityshow.com/plus, where you can upgrade your listening experience for the Productivity Show. And it's also a way to support the podcast. So if that's something you're interested in, please go ahead and go to that URL, theproductivityshow.com/plus. And thank you everyone so far who has already subscribed and supporting the show. All right, Marmel, if you were going to start over, what would you recommend to someone else?
The first, well, aside from self-assessment, is what you shared, Tan. Reading blog posts, and just there's a lot of free information online these days compared to probably 15 years ago. So like Asian efficiency, our blog has like a ton of information, and it's free. So I'd start there. No, it doesn't mean that everything that I read I'm going to apply. It's going to take me like probably 100 years to apply everything. But at least knowing that there are some things that can be done. For example, the Pomodoro method. I had no idea about the Pomodoro method. It was not until I joined Asian Efficiency that I learned about it, and then I read our own blog posts, and I learned how to use that in my own productivity journey. So that's one thing. And also, finding out, I would find out where I am currently at. Like, what is my point A and what is my point B? And then finding out what the gap is, and then working on that based on the education that I've learned through, listening to a podcast or reading blog posts. And then thirdly, write things down. I never really journaled consistently before, but knowing what I know now, just the importance of it, and especially what Brooks learned when he stopped journaling. That's probably one of the things that I'm going to do. Make sure that I do consistently is to journal, write things down, and then focus on the basics. We tend to take it for granted, like our habits. What are the habits that I want to build? What are the habits that I want to let go? Right? Because we always think about, okay, this is going to be my morning habit. This is going to be my evening habit, and sometimes we tend to forget that we have bad habits that we have to let go. So knowing the basics or going through the basics is really important as well, and that's one thing that um, I'm going to do. And then set myself up for success. When you're learning something new, and I noticed this about myself before, is that when I'm learning something, I get so excited, right? Then I'd probably, if it were the old me, I'd probably start with a gazillion list of things that I want to do. But knowing what I know now, I'll set myself up for success by just setting, a few goals, probably one or two. Make sure that I reach those goals first, because if I have like 10 goals right at the bat, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to finish even half of those, and then I'd feel bad, and then I'm off the productivity bandwagon again. Okay. So yeah. So, and lastly, talk about it. Talk about productivity. Talk about it with my friends, with my family, and especially coworkers. Looking back, I started working when I was 21 years old. During that time, it felt like being in the corporate world. It felt like receiving 100 emails per day was like a badge of honor. And we know right now that's not true, right? But we never really talked about it. We didn't talk about how unproductive other meetings are. Like, like being able to talk to, do you really need me in that meeting? Or is it something that I don't have to attend? And then, if there's a summary email, then you can just send it to me. So we never talked about it at work before when I started working. And probably that's why, even if I worked 16 hours a day before, it felt like I never really got anything done, right? Because a lot of the things that everybody did was very unproductive, right? So those are the things for me.
Something really jumped out that you said to me, Marmel, which is to assess where you currently are and to find out what your point A is, like what your starting point is. Now, Tan, I know you have very strong opinions and thoughts on that. That's something you've talked about a lot. So if you're cool with it, maybe you could share why it is so important to know where your starting point is. Like, isn't it enough to just know the goal and go for it? Like, why is it so important for Marmel to have said that she needs to know her starting point first?
Yeah, this is something we teach a lot inside our goal-getting courses and materials. It's just the idea that most material out there focuses exclusively on the destination, right? Hey, let's go to London. We need to go there. This is point B. This is the direction we're heading into. And none of us really talk about our starting point. And what people miss is that if you don't know what your starting point is, it's kind of hard to come up with a strategy to get to point B in the most efficient and effective way. So to give you an example, if you and I, Brooks, both want to go to London as an example, and your starting point is Vancouver in Canada, and my starting point is in Manchester, UK, guess what? We're both going to end up at the same destination, but how we get there will be very different. And the resources it might take to get there is going to be very different as well, right? So you being in Vancouver, a couple options of you getting to London would be you could walk there, but it might take you a really long time and you might even be starved to death by the time you get there. and you might have to come up with an extra plan to figure out like how you're gonna, walk across Canada, cross the ocean, right? Have enough food, drinks, or if you want to cycle, you could even do that, or go on a motorcycle. Like there's just a lot of logistical things you have to think of, right? Or you could fly and you would get to the same destination, but it might cost you more money, right? It's like different resources and circumstances around getting to the same destination. Because if I'm in Manchester, UK, I could take the train, might cost me like a few quid, and then I'll be there in a few hours, and I'll be there at a destination that you and I were going to meet at anyway. We're going to be at the same point, but how we got there is very different, and our strategy is very different. Like flying from Manchester to London is a possibility, but I could also take the train. I could even walk, or I could even take the car or whatever, right? I have so many more options, and logistically, it's much easier to get there. And so my way of picking a plan, a strategy, the resources that I need are going to be different from you, because we have a different starting point. And so when all of us are so exclusively focused on the goal, we don't come up with a good strategy, because we don't think about what our starting point is. So when Marmel kind of mentioned like, hey, I want to know what point A is, and then think about point B and what's the gap between that, that really shows like, in a way, like one, maturity in terms of goal setting. So kudos to you, Marmel. But also just the savviness around, okay, what's the gap? Like, what's the gap that I need to close between point A and point B? And what do I need to do? What's my strategy kind of to close that? And that shows a certain level of experience that I think a lot of people are missing. So Marmel, kudos to you for sharing all of this. And for those who are listening, Marmel has been with the company for many years, and just hearing all of this makes me really proud to see where you are today compared to where you were when you first started off. Because Marmel, when she joined the company, she was not a productivity nut whatsoever. She had to learn everything over the years, from just like seeing our course material, doing her own work, going on her own journey. So I'm super proud of you, Marmel, for all the things you've accomplished, and you're still learning and growing as well. So I'm super proud to have you on the podcast, and also for everyone else to learn from your story and journey as well. Brooks, moving on to you here. If you had to start all over again, what would you do or recommend?
Yeah, well, before talking about me, I just want to share some things that the live stream is sharing, because we've been talking about knowing yourself and stuff like that. And there's been some great feedback shared. Giacomo recommends 16personalities.com to do the initial personality test. Rob recommended the Enneagram, for example. And Tom, who I mentioned earlier, recommending the Hook app, takes it to the next level. He shared that all of this stuff is really important to him, and he even puts it all in his email signature. So if you receive an email from Tom, he pasted it there. It shows he has his Enneagram score. It has his Colby index. It has his DISC score. So if you receive an email from Tom, and you know about this stuff, right away what is going to work well for him. So obviously that's been a really powerful discovery process for him, and it just makes it, people just get off on the right foot with him right from the beginning. So I love that. Rob shares that he would learn to type with 10 fingers. Yeah, this is something we've really been trying to instill in my teenagers, who are more used to typing on their phones than keyboards. But even though keyboarding is kind of old school, I think if you learn to type quickly, it really pays off over the years. And he talks about learning speed reading is something that he would have done a long time ago as well. And he recommended a Rev It Up reading by Abby Marks Beal. We actually had her on the podcast back in TPS343, so quite a while ago. But if you want to learn more about speed reading, check that out. But for myself, so I think for me, if I could pick out one thing that I would really focus on if I was starting all over again, is to focus on accountability right from the get-go. I actually really undersold that concept earlier in my career, whether it was in my corporate career or when I first went out on my own after leaving corporate. I tried to do too much on my own, and I really thought that if you are somebody who is productive, if you are somebody who is skilled, you should be able to just do what you need to do and not need other people. And I think that was a Giacomo talked about lessons learned. I think that was a lesson learned for me. Initially, when I left corporate, it was on purpose because I was burnt out. I worked in a large corporate. I worked in client services. So first of all, you had all the personal interaction of working in a large corporate, but then mine was a little high stress. You know, I'd have to deal with $50 million payments crashing on New Year's Eve and having to deal with all that. And so when I went on my own, I really wanted to focus on myself. But what I learned over time is involving other people, both in having them as accountability partners, but also having people to bounce ideas off of, is something I really should have implemented a lot earlier. Because when I joined a mastermind group, this is years ago, my productivity went through the roof. And even though nothing else had changed, just that having that accountability really, really paid off for me. And it wasn't even, I was just doing it because I liked the people. I wasn't even really trying to boost my productivity, but it really had that impact on me. And same with when I joined the agent efficiency team, just this concept of team accountability and the structure of the sprints that we did, my productivity went up as well. Just having that structure and that accountability built right in. So a lot of times when people talk about accountability, they think of it in terms of solo entrepreneurs or startups, but even in corporate, you can still implement this stuff. It's going to look a little different, and it's not, you'd think just because you work with coworkers in a corporate that you would have that kind of accountability, but depending on how your structure it is, it might be missing. So that is definitely something I would go look for implementing, because it would have made a big difference for me a lot earlier. So long answer to a short question, I think I would get an accountability partnership of something way, way earlier, and then work in some sort of defined burst. So whether that is a 2-week sprint, which is what we do at Agent Efficiency, or something else, versus just kind of like working off of whatever I had in my task manager that day. Those two things paired together would have made a really big difference. And like you mentioned earlier, Tan, we are going to be digging into accountability a lot in the next episode, TPS 344.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And before we conclude today's episode here, we always like to end things with simple and actionable steps for you, because that's what we're known for here at Agent Efficiency. There's a lot of information out there, again, and this podcast is an example of that, of free information that's really powerful. But to just distill it to something really simple that you can do today, based on today's episode, if there's one thing that really resonated with you, try to implement that one thing. It's never too late to think about, what you do, how you go about it, and how you can do things better. And if there's anything that really stood out to you today, like that one thing that Brooke said, or that Marmel said, or that I mentioned, take that and run with it, right? So just implement one thing here today and do it for a while before you move on to the next item that we've talked about here today, because we don't like to introduce too many changes at once, because that's usually not as sticky compared to just doing one thing at a time. So if you want to have links to everything that we mentioned in the show notes, you can also go to theproductivityshow.com/343. And next week's episode is all about the power of accountability. So if that resonated with you, definitely check out next week's episode. And again, if you want to have additional resources to be more productive, be sure to check out our quiz at theproductivityshow.com/quiz.